Good morning to our viewers in the United States and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Amanda D'Aquila, the Executive Director of the Heidelberg University Association. On behalf of Heidelberg University Association and the American Council on Germany, I am pleased to welcome you to our first virtual Heidelberg Lecture. We are happy to hold this event as part of WunderbarTogether 2020. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Welf Werner, the Director of the Heidelberg Center for American Studies at Heidelberg University. In February 2018, Welf Werner was appointed Professor of American Studies at the Faculty of Economics and Social Sciences at Universität Heidelberg and Director of the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. His research has focused on international trade in services, financial market globalization, monetary regime change, natural disasters and international risk management, globalization and inequality, welfare state reform, and the economic determinants of populism. But today, the focus will be on how the United States and Europe have approached unemployment during the corona crisis. After some opening remarks by Professor Dr. Werner, Steve Sokol from the ACG will lead a discussion with him. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function in Zoom or send Steve an email using sokol@acgusa.org. He'll try to fold as many questions into the discussion as possible. Professor Werner?
Yes, Amanda, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited that I'm the first speaker in this new edition of the Heidelberg Lectures, and we are going to focus on quite an important topic today, and that is on labor markets, on unemployment, and also on the fight against unemployment in the US and also in the EU, that is in a transatlantic perspective. Of course, we have to keep in mind that this is only one element of the fight against the corona recession. There are unprecedented policy measures underway with respect to monetary policy, with respect to fiscal policy, but not least of all attempts to limit the spread of the virus. Now we start out today with a surprising observation, and the surprising observation is that the unemployment in the corona recession looks very different in the United States than it looks in European countries, at least if we look at the change in unemployment insurance claims that we see here. And we see here the difference between the average of 2019, the monthly average of 2019 and April 2020. We see that the increase in the United States, the increase in unemployment insurance claims is so much more pronounced than in European countries. And now if we look at the next slide, we see that this should not be the case because, of course, in this very dramatic corona recession, we have a similar example on both sides of the on both sides of the Atlantic with respect to growth dynamics. The real GDP percentage change from preceding quarter was minus 3.8% in the Eurozone and minus 4.8% in the US. So we have similar downturns, and with similar downturns, we should also have similar developments with respect to unemployment, at least roughly so. Also, when we look at then the predictions for the whole year of 2020, we are also in the same ballpark with respect to the downturn on both sides of the Atlantic. So the big question now is, how can we explain this puzzle? Similar growth experience on both sides of the Atlantic, but very different experience in the expansion of uninsurance claims. And now we see in the next slide that what do we see here? We see the blue columns represent the applications for job retention, and I will explain this in a minute. and the red columns represent registered unemployed. And once again, we have here the difference between early March 2000 and the end of May, or latest available data, as a fraction of the total labor force. And we see that the US is an outlier with respect to registered unemployment, very high registered unemployment compared to the other countries. And the other countries have more of these job retention schemes. What is a job retention scheme? The name says it. It's an attempt of governments to keep as many people in their jobs, and it's a subsidy for employers to subsidize the cost of payroll. And this is quite popular. You surely have come across the German word Kurzarbeit, or short time working schemes. And this is the answer to the question why we see so much more unemployment claims in the US, because in European countries and in many other countries, there is another offer. There is not only the offer of being unemployed and receiving unemployment benefits, but there is also the offer of keeping the job, being subsidized for a certain amount of time, and then to continue working in that same job. Now let's have a look at the next slide to have a look at what also in the New York Times sometimes pops up as Kurzarbeit in Germany. There were quite a few articles concerning Kurzarbeit in Germany, and not only now in this recession, but also already in the 2008-9 recession. Companies in temporary distress are eligible to be part of this program. The reimbursement to workers is up to 67% of lost earnings for a maximum of 6 months, in the meantime 12 months, as we see down there that there are quite a few modifications that were made this year. In the meantime, there are 6 million workers in short time in Germany, 14% of the labor force, and the current initial notification has gone up to 10 million, but this is not necessarily take-up. This is the upper bound for take-up. Take-up could be as low as a third. In 2009, in the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, we had 3.3 million notifications in Germany, and a third of these notifications then turned also into workers who participated in this program. Germany's program can be dated back to the year 1910, actually, but Germany has also quite a bit of experience with this program in the crisis of 2008 and 2009, where it's in the literature, it says that 500,000 jobs were saved through the short time work scheme in Germany. And we see that here among 19 OECD countries, almost all of them except 3 have such programs. Okay, next slide. What are the advantages of job retention? Of course, and this is obvious, the main goal is moderation of unemployment, but it's not the most important goal. The most important goal is the maintenance of viable job matches, and this is especially true for high-skilled labor and high-tech industries, where the maintenance of viable matches is more important than in other industries. Certainly, the reduction of social, societal, and political disruption is a goal, and also the avoidance of long-term unemployment, which has more negative consequences in terms of losing social and professional skills. And of course, another goal is to reinforce consumer confidence and demand in the crisis. The job retention in the US, most of you might think that there is not such a program in the US, or that there has not been, but there have been job retention programs in the US actually, called work share or short-time compensation. And 27 states actually offer such programs, but the take-up is not very impressive. Only 62,000 claims in mid-April of this year, compared to 12.5 million claims for unemployment benefits around the same time. And the program design is once again in this traditional program, similar to the program designs of European countries. Employers reduce hours and wages. And now comes an important point, in proportion to reduced hours. That is, if an employer reduces the hours worked for his or her employees by 20%, these employees will also only receive 20% of the unemployment benefits. And the unemployment benefits are, compared to European standards, pretty low, with $375 per week on average. So this person would then receive 20% of $375. And my suspicion is, even though I haven't looked into that, my suspicion is that because the payments are quite low, there is not very much utilization of this program, and there has not been very much. The 60,000 claims are about what was also the utilization in the last year, by the way. Now, the United States, though, has now, with the CARES Act, that is the big $2 trillion stimulus packages, with the CARES Act, it has reduced some elements, some stronger elements of job retention into the United States. One such element is that states are now reimbursed for 100% of the benefits paid under this traditional program, which gave a boost to these state programs. But the most important innovation in the US labor market regime during the crisis is the Paycheck Protection Program, also part of the CARES Act. It's administered by the Small Business Administration and by banks who hand out the loans. It is for small and medium business for up to 500 employees. The loans that are handed out by the banks, this is now very important once again, these loans turn into grants in proportion to foregone dismissals of personnel. So far, all companies that have signed up for this program, almost all of them have made use of this possibility to turn the loan into a grant. And now in this format, then this program is quite similar to programs in Europe. The program allows for a volume of up to 5 times the applicant's average monthly payroll cost. And this money has to be paid to employees within 24 weeks, originally within 10 weeks. Now the utilization looks quite impressive, 4.8 million loans until the end of May, and this was not part of the statistics that we saw. The OECD statistics did not count this new program, just the traditional program. But keep in mind that the take-up in Germany is around 6 million, and that Germany's economy or Germany's population is a quarter of that of the United States. So we still, of course, have so much more Kurzarbeit in Germany than what is now to be seen here in the United States. Interestingly enough, there are also other programs within the CARES Act that have a similar goal to protect paychecks, and that is a program for the air carriers, and there is also a employability retention tax credit. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we see here a comparison between the new job retention schemes in the United States, the PPP, and the program in France. This is the first such study. I expect to see more of those studies that study the design and the implementation of these programs on both sides of the Atlantic. But this is the first one, and what the authors come up with is that they basically say that the United States spends a lot on this new program, on the PPP, but that it doesn't get so much out of it in terms of preventing people from getting unemployed. And you see here also the specific numbers that the US spent 1.8% of its 2019 GDP on job retention schemes, while France spends only 1.4%. Higher US spending did not significantly reduce unemployment, which increased almost 10 percentage points in the second quarter of 2020. And the French unemployment rate increased by less than 2 percentage points. And on the next slide, we finally have also a quick look at the second column of the labor market intervention in the United States. The two most important areas of government intervention around the world are not only the Kurzarbeit schemes, but of course also, on the other hand, then the unemployment benefit programs. And in the United States, as I already mentioned, the average weekly payment is $385 for a maximum of 26 weeks. And this is now ramped up through the CARES Act by an additional $600 per week for a maximum of 38 weeks. So this is a very remarkable increase, and a bit surprising even that the United States is going basically from stingy among OECD countries with this program, or most stingy maybe even, to maybe even most generous. With these 385 plus 600, that is 985, the United States established actually a perverse incentive because these 985 are a bit higher than the median salary of an American worker that is at 950 or so. So for half of the workers, it's a better deal to receive unemployment benefits than to go to work. And this is an incentive structure which we know since the 1980s, since the supply side revolution, as it is called by many people. We know that this is not a good thing. Even though, of course, what can we say? Many people are in very difficult situations, and this is not about saying they should not have that money, but from a microeconomic perspective, we are now used for quite a few decades to look at the incentive structure of those programs. What we also saw was a breakdown of states' unemployment bureaucracies. The computer systems did not keep up with the huge demand. And another problem of these programs, not only in the United States, but also in many other countries, is the uncertain future prospects one of the major goals of these programs is also to introduce stability and to keep consumption up. But if people have only a horizon of 8 weeks or so, that they get some additional funds, that doesn't make them feel much safer. The conclusion I call what I've been seeing in the United States a Europeanization of US labor market policies, not only because of the introduction of the Paycheck Protection Program, the first time that such a program is introduced on a large scale in the United States, whereas in Europe these programs have been in existence for decades. We see also an expansion of unemployment benefits, which are now closer to the European level. And what I should also say is that the fiscal cost of only these two programs is, of course, enormous. It's $919 billion, almost $1 trillion. This is already more now than what the Obama administration spent in early 2009 on its rescue bill back then. And the money is more or less spent already within 3 months. And so the big question is how sustainable are these kinds of programs, because this recession looks more like a marathon than a short recession. There are weaknesses in the program design. These programs are pretty ad hoc, and you might say, of course they are ad hoc. They must be ad hoc because we were faced with a very new situation. But of course, and this is something that we might see also in the discussion, since European countries have much more of a tradition and much more experience with such programs. The German program has been in existence also in good times. The systems introduced in Germany or modified in Germany and other European countries are not as ad hoc as it is in the United States. And the US policies also look a little bit indiscriminate. The Paycheck Protection Program assumes or relies on good faith applications, which seems to be a weakness, and it also pays subsidies for non-payroll expenditures. Once again, there is the question of incentives. Is there the incentive for an employer to apply for the program, because the application will not only lead to subsidies for employees, but also subsidies for the company? There seems to be a lack of experience with good practices in the United States, and this is my last remark. The EU has been engaging in what is called the Lisbon Agenda for 10 years, between 2000 and 2010. This agenda was about learning from each other about the best practices in labor market regimes. This is it from my side, but I still have one slide. So if I would stop now, maybe we can look at the next slide, but if I would stop now, you might think, well, here speaks a German, here speaks a European, and says that things are better in Europe, things are better in Germany. This is not my personal opinion. I also personally see quite a few disadvantages in the job retention programs, and this is the last slide that I want to show you. Job retention schemes are an impediment to structural change in the economy and to labor relocation. And of course, structural change is something that we have all the time. Our economies expand competitive industries, and the not so competitive industries shrink, and this is the engine of economic growth and of improvements in economic wealth. And these retention schemes may, to a certain degree, endanger this structural change. They may also hinder, thus, as a result of what I just said, quick recovery. I would say that they are not necessarily desperately needed outside high-skilled labor markets. Germany has this program for a good reason. Many of the German medium companies are high-tech companies. They export to the whole world. And not only here in the Heidelberg area, but all over Germany, they rely very much on a long-term cooperation between employers and employees. The job retention schemes are not suitable or not necessarily suitable for long-lasting recessions that lead to significant structural change, and maybe the recession that we are facing is one of those. And they are not necessarily suitable for industries with, that have high separation rates anyhow. For example, in the United States, the separation rate per year is about 40 or 45%. In Germany, it's only 20%. And if you have a country where people change jobs quite frequently anyhow, also in good times, then you would want to allow for change also in bad times, I would say. There is also a serious aspect in the fairness of such programs. If you are unemployed in a European country with high labor protection standards, this is nice for people who have a job. It's the opposite for people who don't have a job, because it's harder for them then to enter the labor market. This is it from my side. Maybe we can have the next slide. Okay, yeah.
So let me jump in here and let me thank you, Welf Werner, for that fantastic presentation. A number of comments have come in really thanking you for this terrific comparative analysis of what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the US. I personally found it intriguing to hear you talk about a Europeanization of the US labor market policy, and that's certainly something that I'd like to come back to in just a minute. But before we dive into this and put sort of what you've been talking about into a broader context, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that you made in your presentation. Obviously, you talked at great length about job retention schemes and the role that they've played in this current corona crisis. And you talked about how both the German government out of tradition, the US government in this new context have tried to manage unemployment. And I guess the first question I would have for you is are there any lessons from Germany's experiences with Kurzarbeit that are transferable to other countries, particularly to the US?
I think it's interesting that the US has been trying this European format now for the first time on a grand scale. And I'm not sure. I think the experience this year in the United States will show how efficient this program runs for the United States. I don't think that this type of program is good for all economies. I'm not quite sure that it will be as efficient in the US economy with the high separation rates as it is in Europe. But I think that the experience with this new program will certainly will give some insights. It's not only the separation rate that is different between the United States and countries like Germany, but there is also quite a bit of structural change in the US economy. The US economy takes a lot of its power out of structural change. And I'm not sure, Steve, at this point, and we will see more studies coming out. I think it's still too early because just by looking at the design of these programs, it's not possible to see what the outcome is, how many jobs were saved in the end. And who knows how many jobs are saved this time in Germany, because if the recession takes longer, then there will be a limit to what such a program can do.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes perfect sense. I'd also like to follow up with another question. You showed us a comparison and commented that it's one of the first comparisons between what's going on in the US and France. And in that slide, and based on your presentation, you said that higher US spending did not significantly reduce unemployment. But can you talk a little bit more about why that was the case? Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, this was at least what these authors, the result that these authors presented, and it's a study that came out in the famous Peterson Institute of International Economics. I have to say that the results are not quite up to date. 4 weeks in this kind of environment are a long time. And so the results don't show the full result of the reduction of unemployment in the United States. I would say that already the last month and the 2.5 percentage points reduction in unemployment, which is very good news for the United States. The US had 14.7 unemployment and is now down to 11%. I would like to look at how much this new program contributed to the downward trend of official unemployment. It was, as far as I saw, not so much in the media in the US that this new program could be the cause of the lower unemployment rate, which would be not only necessarily good news, because it would mean that people just moved from one program to another. But at the time the study was finished, the authors found that the US had spent so much more compared to GDP than France. And at the time of their study, some 5 weeks ago, when they finished up the study, they did not see that so many people use this program. I gave you the current number of 4.6 million, which I also said is not so very high by European standards, by German standards. Our number compared to the labor force is 4 or 5 times as high. And we also saw that the US spent about 500 or 600 billion on this program. And this is, if you look up the study, this is what they have a little bit a closer look at there in the study.
So I'd obviously like to come back to this current moment and talk a little bit about the path forward. But before we do that, I'd like to maybe try to put this moment in context. Obviously, we're experiencing a simultaneous public health, economic, and social justice crises, and yet this is all happening as overarching developments take place in labor market regimes in the US and in Europe. And so it might make sense, to spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about what has changed over the past few decades before the current crisis even set in.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Steve, to put it into a historical perspective, because the differences that we see during the crisis reflect very much fundamental differences in the labor market regimes on both sides of the Atlantic. And I also brought a slide. I don't know if you can bring the slide up. Michael, can you see if you can bring up the slide?
Yeah, we can share your screen again, just a second.
There are 2 more slides that I did not include in the presentation, and this is almost the last slide that I'm interested in, that I would like to bring up. One more, the next. Yeah, that's the one. And why is the current labor market characteristics on both sides of the Atlantic a reflection of historical developments? What we see here is that the labor market regime of a country consisting of 4 elements is in the EU very much a labor market regime that has a very high level of so-called passive labor market policy, that is basically unemployment benefits. We traditionally have pretty high unemployment benefits compared to the US. The US has that now too for 3 months at least. What we have in Europe traditionally is a very high level of active labor market policies. Active labor market policies help unemployed to upscale their qualifications and thus to then re-enter the labor market. That's a kind of policy that is almost non-existent in the United States. We will see this in another slide in a minute. And then we have 2 more criteria for a labor market regime, that is employment protection. And this employment protection, that is how easily can an employee be fired, basically. This employment protection is very low in the US. That, of course, leads to a lot of flexibility in the US labor market, on the other hand. And the EU has brought the employment protection from one of the highest levels in the world in the last century, in the late last century, to a medium level compared to the United States in the last 20 or 25 years. And the 4th element is the availability for work requirements. And this is about if someone is unemployed, will he or she has to accept a job with a lower pay or in a different city. And people unemployed didn't have to do that in Germany in the 20th century, and today they have to do that. So European labor market regimes changed quite a bit in the direction of flexibility, but we still keep our security part. Flexicurity is a system that was introduced by Denmark in the 1990s, and most of the European countries have copied this system. So against this background, we see that this is a Europeanization that is currently going on, because PLMP and ALMP, were the 2 sides of the Atlantic, had different traditions change. I would like to show briefly another slide, the one before this slide. Here you see what a low level of expenditures the US has as a percentage of GDP for active labor market policies, that is re-education, upscaling of skills. You see the United States very low there with almost non-existent active labor market policies compared to Western European countries, especially to Scandinavian countries, but also to a country like Germany. But also the passive labor market policy, that is the level of unemployment benefits, are extremely low in the United States. And if we would now look at this same diagram for the year 2020, we would see quite dramatic changes here.
Thank you, Welf. Of course, one of the areas of interest for you in your research is also on globalization and inequity. And I'd like to ask you one more sort of big picture question before we come back to the topic of the day. And that is, do you think it's fair to say that American workers are not supported as much as their European counterparts are when it comes to dealing with challenges like globalization and increasing competition from low-wage countries?
Yes, I think that the numbers that we just saw speak a very clear language with respect to how much support workers receive in the North Atlantic. These are very different worlds, the Western Europe and the United States. There is so much more support for Western European workers, and not only in the recession, but also in rough times for individuals and individual industries. And of course, Western economies have been facing 2 challenges in the last couple of decades, and that is one was productivity improvements, which is a nice thing. This is the engine of higher wages and improved welfare levels. But for blue-collar workers, it's an existential challenge because they will have to move into different industries, into expanding industries. The other challenge is more competition from abroad, more competition from low-wage countries. And if you take these two things together, then Europeans have decided that they have to ramp up the education system. They have to ramp up passive and active labor market policies to get through these challenges. The United States has introduced the activating welfare state in the 1990s reforms of the Clinton administration and the Republican Congress. But if you look at the numbers, there is not very much in terms of activating going on. And if you allow me one more result, it's not about only labor market policies, but if we look at the PISA studies of the OECD and we look at educational attainments in primary and secondary school levels, or also at the social mobility, what is the likelihood of a kid from a blue-collar family to have the same success in the school system as a kid with from a family with an academic background? I find that surprising. Where would you expect is the United States on a scale of 30 countries? It's one of the richest economies. It's a country that is a country of opportunity. At least this is how most of us see the United States. But where is the US positioned with respect to the chances that a kid has at age 6 to be successful? The United States, is it at place 5 or 10 or 15? No, it's at place 27 out of 30. That is, it's not only the labor market regime that gives a hard time to your average worker by European standards, but it's the whole education system. Very last remark, all this is, I think, a very serious business, because we know from experience, also from the 20th century, for politicians, they can answer the challenge that half, in the case of the United States, half of workers have not seen any increase in their real wages in the last 40 years. And people are unsatisfied, understandably. And there are two answers from politicians, basically. One is, we have to help you upscale. We have to help you be competitive in this global world. Or the latest answer is, okay, our enemy is foreign countries and maybe even certain groups that have come into our countries. And I think that the first answer is the right answer. It was the answer that the US gave in the golden era of capitalism in the post-war decades of the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you, Bev. I'd like to sort of paraphrase one of our viewer questions and ask you, as an economic historian, to not think that far back, but to think back to the global financial crisis, and whether there's any comparison that can be made between how Europe and specifically Germany and the US fared after the global financial crisis in terms of GDP growth, productivity, and unemployment rates, and this current simultaneous crisis that we're living through.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent question from the audience. The recession, the 2008-9 recession, was actually a double-dip recession in Europe, not only for Germany, but also for other European countries. And it became very dramatic in 2010 when we had the euro crisis on top of the original recession, which was basically due to a design mistake of the monetary union. The monetary union is in many respects a nice thing, but it reacts very unfavorably to what we call external shocks, that is, to recessions where each and every country reacts very differently. So looking at the experience of coming out of the 2008-9 recession, the US was slow in getting out. It took some 10 years to get back to the old level of wages. And we remember that the Obama administration was not looked at favorably because of it for quite a while. But in Europe, the situation was much worse, and the rebound came much later. Although we cannot really speak about Europe in this case, we need to speak about the North and the South. For Germany, not least because of the Kurzarbeit scheme, and not least because Germany continued to export all its goods to southern crisis countries. There was also a lot of criticism on Germany. Germany survived the crisis quite well, but if you compare the southern countries, the Mediterranean countries, with the US experience, the US did quite well.
Welf, I found your footnote to your presentation particularly interesting, as I'm sure other viewers did as well, when you were talking a little bit about some of the shortcomings of these job protection programs, for example, as an impediment to structural change. And one of our viewers asks whether we're looking at a period of structural change now, or whether these kinds of programs aren't suitable for short-term crises like the one that we're in, rather than a long-term recession. And obviously the hope at the moment is that the corona crisis will pass and things will sort of return back to normal. But I guess the question to you is, how deep do you think this crisis is? And are we experiencing structural change, or are we in the midst of a longer recession?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, it looked to a lot of observers like a short recession, and that once we go back into normal life, everything else will be back to normal. But I have my doubts about that, because the problems that have emerged so far are so serious that I'm afraid to say that this recession has already started to develop a dynamic of itself, and that the pandemic was only the starting point. Once we have interruptions in international trade, once the trust is gone, once we have insolvencies among companies, the next questions is then always, what about the financial sector? What about emerging economies? They don't have the same options to do as much deficit spending. So we are in a phase, and it's not only the face-to-face service sector now that sees a problem, but because people have been spending less, people have been investing less, people have been trading less. We see now a broadening of the recession to basically all sectors of the economy, to all industries. And the main question is going to be the stability of the financial sector. That's the next in row. And the stability of the world economy in terms of emerging economies. That will be the next challenges. The good news is that our central banks have done a great job in keeping up liquidity and have the experience of the 2008-9 recession. So they're really doing everything they can, and they don't have to go through a democratic process, which may be problematic also in an election year.
So I'd like to take another viewer question. One of our corporate members here in New York writes, how do you see the ability of European economies to eventually roll back these employment support programs? The case of the United Kingdom seems very interesting, with very high resilience on the government's furlough support. Almost a third of all UK jobs are dependent on this program right now, but UK companies are already cutting jobs in anticipation of less government support as of October. Germany's Kurzarbeit program is also a very powerful program, but it would seem without this support, or if the program is cut back, that German jobs and that the German job market might be more fragile as well.
Yeah, I agree with this, and this is also why I had this long list of question marks about the Kurzarbeit program, because As you just heard, I'm more on the pessimistic side about how deep and how long this recession is. And these Kurzarbeit schemes, they are good for a short recession because it makes sense to keep people for a couple of weeks or a maximum a couple of months in these programs. But after a while, you have to ask yourself what's going to happen to these people, what's going to happen to these programs. And then it's a challenge because they have a high fiscal cost. Can the countries continue these programs? This is also a question that Congress will have to decide early next week. What are they going to do next? They have spent almost $1 trillion in 3 months on labor market policies, which looked European, but neither Europe nor the US has unlimited resources. And there will be also political influences that say how much can we spend for how long. So I do also have my suspicions that there are limits to what we can do with those programs, especially when you have a pessimistic view on the current crisis.
Mm-hmm. So let me take another viewer question. One of our viewers writes, in the United States, the payroll protection program had to go through private banks. This has been recognized as a problem because private banks had a strong incentive to favor larger companies and larger loans. In Germany, in comparison, public banks, particularly at the national level, like the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, and at the local level, Sparkassen, play a central role in these programs. Do you think that financial institutions who were gatekeepers are important in the respective German and US approaches to the COVID crisis from an economic perspective?
Well, before we met here today, I looked at quite a bit of literature on both sides of the Atlantic. I didn't see anything that said that the financial institutions had a gatekeeper function in the sense that they kept certain groups outside of the program or favored certain groups, although it makes sense if I think about it that maybe for the banks, because I think they earn a percentage or so, a certain percentage amount of the volume of the loan. So it would make sense, but we will have to wait for empirical studies. But only recently, in the last couple of weeks, we received from the Small Business Administration numbers about the average size, and I also gave you numbers. The average size is not very high. It was initially 100 and something $1,000, and now it moved up to 200,000. But you could read in the New York Times that possibly it was impossible for the very small companies to go through all the red tape and to apply to these programs. There was this fear in the early days of the program. But now that I looked at the numbers of the Small Business Administration that were just published recently, I did not get the impression that that was the case, but the numbers looked so small. In the beginning, it was said that these big chain companies, restaurant chains and hotel chains really were first in line. And it was also a criticism that these programs were handed out on a first comes, first served basis. And of course, these chain companies, these big restaurant chains and hotels, they were much better prepared with their lawyers and their accountants to do it right away and to be first in line. And back then, when the program was introduced first, after 13 days, it was already oversubscribed. And so it looked like, well, the big ones got it and the small one didn't. But then Congress decided to extend it and to add another, I don't know, 250 or 260 billion on top. And so that criticism is not there so much anymore as it was in the beginning.
And I think at this point, they haven't even expended all of the money that's available. One of the recent reports that I heard was that they were extending the deadline for loan applications because there was still a significant amount of money that was left.
Yeah, there is still more than 100 billion there. Mm-hmm.
So Beth, as we start to sort of come to a close in our conversation today, one topic that you've mentioned a couple of times has been the importance of stability. Obviously, that's something that I think for anybody who follows the global economy is incredibly important. And I'd like to ask you maybe to look forward a little bit. Do you think that a recession caused by the corona crisis, like other severe recessions that have come before, could lead to a real change in established policies in Europe and in the United States? And I guess another way of asking that question, and it's a question that I come back to often in different contexts right now, is do you think that we are at an inflection point due to the current crisis that we're living through? And could there be fundamental changes to labor market policy in Europe and in the United States?
Yeah, if I look at this question as an economic historian, we see examples in history, the Great Recession, that changed so much in the United States, the whole understanding of the relation between market and government. And then we also can look at the 2008 and 2009 crisis in the US, where we had similar conversations saying, well, will we see a very different structure of the financial sector in the United States? And not very much came from the 2008-9 recession in terms of fundamental change. Almost, I don't want to say almost nothing, but nothing on the scale of the developments after the Second World War. So both things are possible. What we will have to deal with is, after the recession, is a very strong government in almost all countries in the world, much expanded fiscal expenses, and thus a much smaller role of the state. And we will see what normalization then means in the US. After the First World War and the Second World War, normalization did not mean normalization. It still meant that the taxes were very progressive and that the level of public spending still was very high. I don't know that for the United States. Another problem that we will have to deal with is the high debt level. And a third challenge that I think will decide a lot of things is also the global race, how China presents itself currently to the world, and how the United States presents itself to the world. I think these are the three big questions that will have to be answered, and where we see either change or not so much change. And with respect to labor market policies, it will be interesting to see whether or not the United States is going to Europeanize its labor market regime a bit more, even after the recession, and will have structures in place to help American workers to upscale their qualifications, as I said, independently of the corona crisis. At least this would be my personal wish for the United States, that workers get more of an opportunity to compete with their qualifications in the world labor markets. I would go so far to predict that the Kurzarbeit schemes are here to stay in European countries.
Well, Welf Werner, I want to thank you for really honing in on this topic with us today. As you said at the beginning, there are many factors to consider. The labor market and labor market policy is just one when you think about monetary policy, fiscal policy, and other policies that are necessary as we try to overcome the combined crises of the current moment. And I just want to thank you for spending this very informative hour with us on behalf of both the American Council on Germany and the Heidelberg University Association. Thank you for this wonderful discussion, and let me turn it over to Amanda to have a final word.
Yes, I'd also like to thank you very much from our side. And Professor Werner, your remarks were wonderful, and it was an engaging discussion. And we are also pleased, to Steve, for your support and from the support of American Council on Germany as well, to be able to work together.
Well, I would like to thank you for your generous invitation to be the first speaker in this second edition of the Heidelberg Lectures. It was a great pleasure, and I wish I could have seen some of the audience, as we all wish these days, but I'm sure we are going to have the opportunity to meet here in Heidelberg, and I would like to also extend an invitation to all your viewers and listeners to come to the Heidelberg Center for American Studies once all this crisis is over. Please come to Heidelberg, please come and visit. And maybe I can say one thing at the very end, that we have been recording a podcast in German language, and that is entitled Corona in den USA. And we have tons of listeners. We have in the meantime 50,000 listeners for 10 sessions in Germany. So I guess that quite a few people in the audience also speak German, understand German. And I would like to invite you not only to our wonderful home here at the center of the old city in Heidelberg, but also to get acquainted with us through our webpage and also this podcast. But once again, thank you so much for having me. I'd be happy to be back one day.
Well, of course, we all look forward to reconvening in person sometime, whether here in New York or in Heidelberg. And until then, I think things like your podcast and discussions like this one are going to have to be what we rely on. And so I very much look forward to continuing to collaborate with Amanda and the Heidelberg University Association for more Heidelberg lectures.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.